Okay, here you go.
Okay, tonight our speaker is Norm Rickeman. That E's silent, right?
It goes both ways.
Okay, all right.
It's pronounced, but
Thank you.
nobody gets it right.
Rickman, Reitman, however you want to say it, this way, good, okay. Now, I'll just read what I put in the paper about him. Tim and I went to the South Carolina Archives Symposium, Revolutionary War Symposium, another excellent symposium, and you kind of start seeing the same people around at some of these historical events. But Norm was one of their speakers there. And I was so impressed with his talk. And then I found out that he's not from South Carolina, and he loves this place. And so you have a special place in my heart. If you're a South Carolinian, I expect you to love your state. And for you to move here and love it, Tim, I have to say, has moved here and he loves it, and he's a Texan. But anyway, let me just tell you a little bit about Norm. Let's see, he was a lifetime history nut, and he began volunteering as a docent for the National Park Service at Fort Moultrie when he moved to Sullivan's Island from Minnesota. Do you like the weather here, Norm?
Yes. Not in August.
Yeah, nobody likes it in August. He was familiar with Francis Marion and Osceola, but he had never heard of William Moultrie or the Battle of Sullivan's Island on June the 28th, 1976. Norm's engaging talk not only tells of the importance of this battle in the Revolutionary War, but he weaves the story of how our state flag came to be, Francis Marion's role in building the fort, and the importance of men of color, how important they were to this huge endeavor. School-age children learning South Carolina history and their teachers should all hear this talk. So I'm promoting Norm to travel the state, to schools, to 250 meetings, whatever, and give this talk. But Norm will have you standing in line for a ticket to Fort Moultrie. He is just a fantastic docent, and somebody told me the other day that you had just given them a tour, and they were just so complimentary. And I said, well, I'm going back to Fort Moultrie just so Norm can give me a tour. So Carolina Day will celebrate its 250th on June the 28th of 2026. This is an important day because it was how many days before the Declaration of Independence was actually signed?
6.
6 days. So South Carolina is in the lead on this revolutionary business. I'm just here to tell you. Anyway, one last little thing is that Norm's book, all the proceeds go, he didn't charge $250, Lee County $250 to come and talk to us. Thank you, Norm. But he does sell these little books that kind of go along with their talk for teachers, for whatever. It's, you know, not a heavy read or anything, but it's just packed with good information. And all the sales go to the Friends of Charleston National Parks. So, Norm, we welcome you to our little Bishopville, and we are so glad that you were able to come and talk to us tonight.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Is it blue bottom?
Hello? Better?
Yeah.
Thank you, Andy. That's much more than I deserve. And I'm being filmed. As I've said someone earlier, this is my film debut, but people have told me for years that I'm the spitting image of Clooney. Then they say Rosemary Clooney. This is one of the few groups I can still tell that joke where they get it. So, yeah, but I love Rosemary Clooney. I'm here, I will go anywhere and talk to any group about this while I still can. I've been working at Fort Moultrie for 4 years. I'll get right to the spoiler alert. I think this battle is the greatest underdog victory in the history of American warfare. And we began winning the revolution on June 28th, 1776. And because of factors that could have been, had the British taken Charleston, before they did in 1780, which, if you Google the biggest defeat of the American Revolution, what does it say? The fall of Charleston in 1780. If Charleston had fallen in 1776 with the demographics in Charleston, I think the Brits would have had a much easier time controlling the countryside. The Declaration of Independence had been signed. You know, we didn't really know what we were fighting for as patriots. There were a lot of Tories, a lot of loyalists, a lot of friends of the king, a lot of neutral people, right? So if the British win that battle, get into Charleston, the jewel of the East Coast, and march redcoats up and down and ships in the harbor, the population is going to perceive they're going to be the victors. So I think this battle is sometimes profiled as the first victory over the British Navy or one of the first victories of the Revolution. I think it's way undersold in terms of its strategic impact. I compare it to Bunker Hill favorably. We've all heard about Bunker Hill. I find nobody outside of the local area seems to have heard about the Battle of Sullivan's Island. I think it compares very favorably. One major difference, you know, Sullivan's Island was a victory. Bunker Hill was technically a defeat because the British held the field. But it was a strategic victory because it led to the British eventually abandoning Boston. It's a very, very significant victory. A lot more casualties. Sometimes people look at casualties and put a lot of weight on that. Anyway, before I get into it, I want to tell you a little bit about my background. I was a business consultant. I did a lot of history reading. We moved to Sullivan's Island. I checked out Fort Moultrie, asked if they had volunteer activities there. Kind of was intrigued with the history of the area, so I started volunteering for the Park Service at Fort Moultrie. And there was this little thing called, the Revolutionary War battle was fought here too. I said, really? So I said, that's cute. You know, what is that? So I look into it. And the more you delve into it, this is reading Park Service stuff. Ed Bears, who is the National Park historian, wrote a 170-page treatise, I would call it. It wasn't a book. It was never widely published, but it was internal to the Park Service about the battle. And then there was a book published in 2002 called Victory on Sullivan's Island by David Lee Russell that I tracked down. And it's out of print. He had no interest in republishing it, or his publisher, which to this day shocks me. Because why wouldn't you? He did a lot of research. I use it heavily in my book. And I would think you'd want to get that story out now that we're approaching the 250th anniversary. But there wasn't a lot of interest. And I said, what am I missing? I'm missing something here because this seems like a much bigger deal to me. I must be missing something, because if this were as big a deal as I think it is, you know, we'd all know about it, so I must be getting something wrong. Well, not understanding the significance of it is not a rationale for not respecting the significance of it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I tried to get Russell to republish his book in time for the 250th. No, I talked to some of the rangers there who had published books. I said, somebody needs to get a book out. Yeah, we're too busy. So I finally said, I'll do it myself. So that's what I did. It's $20 to all to the Friends of Charleston National Parks. It sounds corny, but it's why don't I want to take royalties? I'm not worthy. I'm not worthy of making money off of what those people did. So my only goal was to help get the word out in a small way. But in doing thinking about why am I worthy to do this? Other people should be doing this, not me. I tracked down something called I want to read this to you. This is the official excerpt, the Battle of Sullivan's Island. This is the official definitive account from the West Point Atlas of American Wars, Volume 1, 1689 to 1980. There are 2 volumes. These are thick books. These are used as textbooks at West Point. The subtitle, A Definitive History of American Combat. So this tells you everything you need to know about all significant American contact as taught to our future military leaders. They teach the cadets. Definitive means everything you need to know. So I'm just going to read what they say, and then we can all go home. All right? This is the account. Every word. The initial British offensive in 1776 was in the Carolinas. where Major General Sir Henry Clinton's attempt to seize Charleston was severely repulsed. Do you have any questions?
That was good.
That's it. That's not just wrong, that's an abomination. Really is. So then I said, well, wait a minute, maybe I am qualified to do this, because that's not definitive. And guess what? They called Major General Sir Henry Clinton. He wasn't knighted until after the Battle of Long Island, which was later the same year in New York. He wasn't a sir when he was on Sullivan's Island. We all know that. I mean, everybody knows that. So I said, maybe they're not as definitive as they think they are. So that gave me the confidence to say, I'm just go ahead and do it. That's my only slide that doesn't advance. And I'll talk about this. This picture is on the wall at the visitor center at Fort Moultrie. It's very misleading, but it's a very impressive picture. Let's talk about, before we get into the battle, let's talk about Moultrie. Moultrie was, y'all, I don't have to give you Moultrie's biography, do I? He was a planter, son of a Scottish physician. Not much is known about his mother. He was one of the guys. I read his memoirs, and I've read a lot about him. I read his biography by Chip Bragg. He was one of the guys. He was a solid citizen guy, very reliable. He fought in the Cherokee Wars in 1760 with Francis Marion. And he was one of those guys you could count on. Continental Congress has happened in 74, 75. South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia participated in that. South Carolina comes back and says, we need to create a committee of safety. We're going to form 3 regiments of militia in advance of what might be coming here. Moultrie was assigned to be the colonel of the 2nd Regiment of militia. And he was initially assigned to Fort Johnson, which is in Charleston Harbor, where the first shot at Sumter came from. That was years later. So the British abandoned Fort Johnson, and Moultrie and his militia took it over. They said, hey, we need, just to show ships coming in that fort on the harbor is now in our hands, not the British hands, we need a flag. So that's what prompted Moultrie to design the Moultrie flag, which you see here. Some versions of it don't have liberty in it. People are what I found in giving this talk, people are very sensitive about the flag, the early history of the flag. So this is my shot at it. It has multiple versions. One thing for sure we know is the crescent is not a crescent moon. We all know that, right? But I don't want to get into that. We could talk about a whole session on the crescent on the flag. I think it's a gorget. Some people say it's a second sun symbol, whatever. So what happens is, this is going on in the colonies. The royal governors of South and North Carolina and Georgia decide, hey, guess what? We've all been kicked out of our quarters. They're all, Peter Campbell, for example, in Charleston had to escape to a British ship in Charleston Harbor for safety. Same thing happened in Georgia and in North Carolina. So those 3 royal governors sent in a message to London, basically pleading for help. The gist of it is, hey, this rebellious stuff that's going on over here, this is really being driven up north by those crazy people in Massachusetts and New York and Virginia. People down here, these guys are our friends. Moultrie, we fought with guys like Moultrie. These are our friends. And Charleston, as you probably know, was the richest city in the colonies by far. By far. Indigo, rice, slave trade, phosphates, minerals. It was a very diverse economy. Of the top dozen wealthiest individuals in the colonies, probably 9 of them were Charleston planters. So from a British standpoint, why would they want to rock the boat? Apparently they didn't really understand that rich people don't like to pay taxes either, but that's another story. They send this plea to England, London. The king, and one of their arguments was, based on some fact that a lot of the population, the governors, the leadership of these colonies are supporting this Continental Congress stuff, but the people are still friends of the king. A lot of them are friends of the king. We have lots of Tories, a lot of loyalists, lots of people that want to stay neutral, just don't want to get involved. So what you're going to see is if you send forces here to the south, those people will rise up and help us in our endeavors, or at least they won't fight. So the sooner you get here, the better. and it'll be easy peasy to control the southern colonies and in effect, create a second front to Washington in the north. The king responds. They set up a major fleet off the coast of Cork, Ireland, under the command of Sir Peter Parker. This is, I believe, before he became Spider-Man. I'm not sure. This always goes over with the kids for the moment. Peter Parker, and one thing to note is the assault force that we'll talk about. This wasn't the B team, this wasn't the C team. Parker eventually became head of admiral of the entire British fleet. He was a commodore at the time, but he'd already been knighted. They put together a massive fleet, and the idea would be to come off the coast of North Carolina, where they're going to meet up with General Henry Clinton, who's coming down from New York with some redcoats. Redcoats are coming from Cork, Ireland, also under the command of Lord Cornwallis. This was Cornwallis's first appearance in the colonies. He came over on the fleet, and that was the first time he set foot in the American colonies. But he did that knowing when he got here, he would be second in command to General Clinton, who later assumed command of all the Royal Army in the fight later on. So again, these weren't B players. They arrive off the coast they leave in about February. They were supposed to get started in December 1775. They didn't really get started until late January, early February 1776 due to weather, other situations, delays, coordination, getting ships loaded. They decided to put on some prisoners of war to exchange, one of whom, by the way, was Ethan Allen, the Green Mountain Boys. He came over on this cruise, and he went off the coast of Cape Fear, but then he went north to New York. So when they got to Cape Fear, they said, what are we going to do now? And something had happened inland. Part of the message of the royal governors was, we'll send a force of about 1,000 loyalists and Tories to meet up with the fleet in North Carolina. And then they'll come on shore there, and then we'll march across and Carolina, take South Carolina, neutralize the South. That was all stymied on a little, again, minor battle. This is how it's profiled, the Battle of Morse Creek Bridge. To give you an idea, there were 2 Patriot casualties. Both forces were a little less than 1,000. 2 Patriot casualties, 50 Loyalist casualties, but 800 prisoners. 800 Loyalist prisoners. Not much of a fight. But it was indicative of the fact that maybe what the Brits thought they were getting in all these Loyalist forces were not what they were cracked up to be. So it wasn't much of a fight, but it was very, very significant victory in that it basically said to Parker and Clinton and Cornwallis, we'll go to Plan B, we're going to go to Charleston. This is what Charlestown Harbor looked like. Am I blocking anybody's view of the street? Huh? Am I okay?
Yeah.
Okay, I know you can't see this. That's why you got to look at the book. This is a map I use at the fort when I talk about this. It shows the strategic value of Charlestown Harbor. And if you can read it, you see the red is Charlestown. You see the shape of the harbor, and all the shaded area is sand. So any invading naval force, and coastline defense was national defense for hundreds of years, any invading force is going to have to cross the Charleston Harbor Bar, which is all that stuff out in the ocean, and then they're going to have to avoid the big sand and go through the deep water, which goes right in front of Sullivan's Island. So that's why the fort on Sullivan's Island was positioned where it was. The defense of Sullivan's Island started also in January of 1776. They had the fortress at Fort Johnson, which you can see on the map is very close to Charleston. A defensive post out on Sullivan's Island was much more strategically valuable. So they moved Moultrie to Sullivan and said, build us a fort. It actually started, and he oversaw the completion of it. build us some kind of defensive fort so that we can stymie the Brits if they come here. And so that's what happened. This is what it looked like as the battle approached. It was a palmetto log and sand fort. Palmetto logs, about 20 feet high, 16 feet of sand, and then another layer of palmetto logs. Palmettos is all they had. You know, they said, what are we going to build this fort out of? Trees, palmetto trees. And your botanists don't even call a palmetto a tree because it doesn't have a solid trunk, which in this case turned out to be good because it's like hard bamboo. And the tree had, you know, characteristics that we'll talk about in a minute that made it very, very effective as a defensive structure. But it was not intentional. It was not, we know this is going to work, let's get palmetto. And they just got that from the surrounding area. The fortress was built by slave labor. Sullivan's, as you probably know, was a slave island. It was a quarantine island in the Middle Passage slave trade. If you're African American, then you can trace your ancestors through the Middle Passage. And then they came to the colonies. There was about a 50% chance they would have come through Sullivan's Island. So that we have a long history. The enslaved people have a long history of supporting everything that happened there. But they built this fort. The shaded areas on this map are the complete parts. You'll see in the back it's not quite complete. The flag you'll see is right there on the water. That's important when we get to talk about Sergeant Jasper. But the fort was basically coming together. But when the Brits sent spies to see what was going on down in Charleston, when they made the decision to come here, they basically described it as undefended. So Charleston, again, the richest city in the East Coast, undefended. Let's just go there, and then we'll make sure there, and we'll go up the Carolinas through Charlestown. My favorite person in the story is Charles Lee. Lee thought he should have been commander of the Continental Army over Washington. He was a Brit. But he had always weird loyalties. So he was in the British Army and then he quit. And I think he fought for Prussia or Poland or something. And then he came back and then he came to the colonies and was not in the army. Was a plantation owner somewhere in the colonies. But when the hostilities started to form here, he said, I agree with the Patriot cause. I'm going to side with the Patriots. And he was viewed as somebody having massive military ability. So they wanted him. And then he thought, again, that he should be considered for commander of the Continental Army over George Washington. That didn't happen, thank God. He was kind of a prickly character. That's why I show him here twice. One's a caricature and the other's, well, they both are kind of caricatures. But he was sent down here, he was second in command to Washington. He was sent down here as a way to oversee what was going to happen. Once the British fleet decided to come to Charleston, Lee came down with a bunch of other Continental Army and other militia forces that ended up on what is now Mount Pleasant and along the coastline. But Lee came into the fort, looked at what was going on, basically said it's a slaughter pen. John Rutledge, you know John Rutledge, who's a very key player, and the chain of command is very, as you look into this, who's in charge? Because Moultrie took his orders from John Rutledge. And Rutledge, you know, was the president of South Carolina, because South Carolina, as you guys always do, wait a minute, as we always do, we're the first to state new territory. So South Carolina decided, you know what, we're not even going to be in the colonies anymore, we're going to be our own little country. So they appointed Rutledge to be the president. So he was President Rutledge. And he had told Moultrie, whatever you do, don't abandon the post that you're building at Sullivan's Island, because if you do, the Brits will get right into Charlestown. That won't be good. Lee comes in here, he looks around, and he looks at that, and he goes, it's a slaughter pen. It's a slaughter pen. And Moultrie says, I think I can defend this post. And then because Lee, it was unclear whether Lee could command him to do anything. Lee went to Rutledge. Rutledge gave lip service to Lee, told Moultrie separately, you're not going to abandon this post over my dead body. And so, and Moultrie was not inclined to do that anyway. So Lee was kind of played with here. He said, well, if you're going to stay, then you've got to build a bridge to what is now Mount Pleasant as an escape route. Moultrie's response was, I'm not thinking of escape. But they gave lip service to that, and it was a kind of a shoddy boat and tug kind of structure that didn't hold anything. So long story short, Lee kept getting more and more frustrated. And he made a decision on June 27th, the night before the battle, to relieve Moultrie of command. Because technically he could do that. He could go and say, Burrellage, he's got to go. He described Moultrie as a half-baked country militiaman. Okay? And he's just got to go. Well, he was planning to do that. He identified the person he was going to put in charge, and he was going to go over the next morning and make the change. Well, the next morning, guess what? The battle started. Remember the picture that I showed you at the beginning, that fancy picture with the ships right on the wall and the one in the visitor center? This is more accurate. The ships never got as close to the walls of Fort Moultrie as that first picture would indicate. The reason for that is do you know who the expert in Charleston Harbor, the expert pilots were? They were freed slaves, or they were enslaved blacks who knew the harbor and were trusted to navigate ships in the harbor. The British used them. So the black pilots of the British ships said, no, we can't get any closer than this because of the sand. And that was kind of a bone of a contention between Clinton and Parker later as to whose fault it was that this thing was a disaster. Clinton said we should have gotten close because the strategy of the Brits for a land that's structure like that is get as close as you can, knock the walls down, and take out the artillery bed in close range. And Moultrie was also advised by naval experts that they would do that in half an hour with his palmetto log fort, half an hour. And his response to that was, well, then we'll fight from behind the rubble. Anyway, battle ensues, about 10:30, shots fired. I'm not going to bore you with all the details of it. The British cannonballs bounce off the palmetto logs or embed. We've all heard that story, right? That's commonly what's known. Do very little damage to the walls. Francis Marion's biographer, Oler, his subtitle is, The Man Who Saved the Revolution, right? Something like that. That's wrong. It should read The Man Who Saved the Revolution twice. Because the first time he did it was on June 28th. He was in charge of the artillery for Moultrie. Moultrie calls him the best shot of anyone he'd ever encountered. Moultrie's cannoneers, Moultrie had 31 cannon, by the way. There were over 270 on the British ships. There were 9 warships in the harbor. And before that, they dropped off 2,500 redcoats on Long Island, which today is Isle of Palms. We'll talk about that in a minute. So this was a major land-sea invasion. The day of the attack, they had already dropped off 2,500 redcoats who had been on the island for a month. And they positioned 9 warships across that bar and then attacked on June 28th. But Moultrie's cannoneer Marion wreaked havoc on the British fleet. The only thing that both the Brits and the Americans said, the paper said later, was the only thing that kept the fleet from being totally destroyed was how they had to ration their artillery. They were outgunned at least 7-1. They found all kinds of cannonballs. They found many more cannonballs after the battle from British ships that then they fired at the British ships themselves. We'll get back to that. Let's talk about the land thing first. 2,500 redcoats were on the next island over. There's a waterway between what was then Long Island and Sullivan's Island called Breach Inlet. And the Brits were told that at low tide, the depth of Breach Inlet was 1.5 feet. So they said, we don't need boats, we'll march across. So they get there, take them about a week to get settled in. Clinton finally decides, we better go check that out. They go check it out. At low tide, it's 7 feet deep. And he didn't have enough time to figure out another alternative attack plan. So on the day of the attack on the land side, and Danger Thompson, the other thing I found out during this talk, by the way, is how many Danger Thompson fans there are. I can't talk enough about Danger Thompson. I'm a big Marion fan, but there are just as many people who love Danger Thompson. So I get criticized for that, making him a bigger part of the story. But he was down with about 780 troops on the Breach Inlet side, and against 2,500 redcoats. Danger had 2 cannons, the British had multiple cannons. One of the things that Lee did well was when he went and checked out what was happening on that, he told Danger to move his men back farther from the edge of the water, because the British cannons could wreak havoc on it. So they did that. He made significant suggestions that improved the odds of what happened at Breach Inlet. But the Brits couldn't get across because it was too deep, so they came across in longboats, maybe 400 at a time. They were easily repelled by Thompson and his crew. So I mentioned Francis Marion. I don't know if this is a good picture of him. It's one of the more handsome ones, so that's why we talked about him already, but he was largely given credit by Moultrie for the effective barrage on the British ships. And the iconic image, of course, of the land battle was William Jasper retrieving the flag. Remember the original picture of where the flag was, it was right on the water. Today, if you go to Fort Moultrie, it's positioned way in the back. But it's on a standing flagpole, which is a tribute to what Jasper did. The Moultrie flag was blown in half, top went over the wall, he retrieved it, brought it back, and anchored it, and so that it would rise for the people at Charlestown to see that the battle was still being fought. We were still in the battle. So very, very courageous thing. One of Moultrie's favorite people, ironically killed 2 years later trying to take Savannah, carrying his troops' colors in his hands when he was killed. Long story short, after about 9-10 hours, nothing's happening with the walls of Moultrie. The firing is sporadic, so Moultrie will stop firing because he doesn't have a lot of ammunition, and it just kind of, it's part of his strategy, and then they'd fire 3 or 4 rounds at a time from each cannon. Many times the Brits thought they had won because the cannon fire had lapsed, only to find out, oh my God, they're still there. And the Brits were in bad shape. The flagship, the Bristol that Peter Parker was on, if you want to use the slaughter pen analogy, his ship could have been called the slaughter pen. The description of the carnage on that is pretty graphic. Parker himself, as you all know, was injured, wounded slightly. You all know that story, right? Cannonball bursts near where he's standing. There's a big whoosh. He looks down at the front of his pants, and they're all slashed. A little bit of blood, not too much. But then he feels a breeze on his backside. So he reaches around. What does he touch? His bare butt cheek. Peter Parker was decanted. I'm not making this up. This actually happened. It's in the record. Again, pretty iconic image. Kids love that story too. So if you look at the, just basic mistakes, Clinton not having an alternative attack plan, not knowing that the 1.5-foot intelligence was wrong until it was too late, Parker getting his pants blown off. I mean, this is, you say, well, these guys competent? To me, it's not a competence issue as much as a overconfidence in how easy this victory was going to be. This was going to be a mosquito swat. So, and these guys were known as very good planners. Clinton and Parker, though, didn't coordinate very well from the get-go. Clinton got off the coast of North Carolina way before Parker, was upset that Parker wasn't there. And so there's all kinds of Army-Navy kind of stuff going on. Clinton said he never got the message that Parker was attacking on June 28th. And if Parker had gotten closer as he should to the walls of the fort, he could have been victorious without a land invasion. So there was a lot of finger pointing going on. In fact, when Clinton was back in 1780, when the Brits did take Charleston, and he actually went out in front of the fort to check the depth, where the black pilot said they couldn't get close, and he figured out they could have gotten a lot closer. So he was that, he was that sensitive to this. 9, 10 hours, the battle's over. The Brits go back across the bar, they retrieve the redcoats, and they go up to New York. It took a while, but they did all that. I think there are 4 iconic images of this battle, if you want to just think about the iconic images of this battle. The cannonballs bouncing off the palmetto logs. I make this one as, well, Parker getting his pants blown off is a classic. This is one that didn't actually happen, but I like to think it did. You know, Henry Clinton going out into the middle of the breach with a 6-foot, rod and going, whoops, and then my favorite is this guy, William Moultrie. 3 other ships during the battle decided to do an end run. Remember the back half of the fort wasn't finished? They were going to go around and do an end run and have a clear angle into the fort to take advantage of that. Moultrie in his memoirs said that if they had been successful, that he thinks the fort would have fallen. But anyway, they all 3 got hung up on the sandbar where Fort Sumter is today. The Brits got 2 of them off. The 3rd one, the Actaeon, they could not get off. So the next morning they set it on fire so that the Patriots couldn't use it. And they must have left some black gunpowder still on that ship, because Moultrie describes watching this from Fort Moultrie, he's watching this fire, and then all of a sudden there's an explosion. And the plume of the explosion makes the perfect shape of, you guessed it, palmetto tree. I mean, you can't make this up. And I've only seen that a couple of times. I think that's an iconic image of what happened. It makes the perfect shape of the palmetto tree. So the people of Sullivan's Island, or people of Charleston, thought this was divine intervention, this victory. It was an act of God. How could it not be? If you look at all the things that had to go right, you have the best Army Navy in the world, arguably, but you could clearly make that argument, against taking the richest city on the East Coast in the colonies. The only defense was an unfinished sand and log fort built by slaves and militia, manned by a militiaman. Here, what did he call him? I can't remember what he called it. Harebrained? No, I can't remember. But it was, and by the way, he suffered from gout too. He had gout this day, Moultrie did. So all these things on paper made this look like it was going to be, not good, and it ended up to be a total victory. Any questions about that? I'm going to talk a little bit about how much time have we got.
As long as you want.
I want to talk a little bit about Moultrie, and then I can wrap up. But that's pretty much the battle. And so when you say, well, why is it so significant? Didn't Charleston fall in 1780 anyway? So what's the big deal, right? It did. It Googled the biggest defeat of the Revolution, it'll say the fall of Charleston in 1780. Well, what would have happened had it fallen in 1776? Like I said before, I think the Brits would have had an easier time controlling the population. It would have been perceived that these guys are going to be the winner. We didn't have the Declaration of Independence, and I would like to be able to tell you that on July 4th, as the signers were putting their pens over this paper. By the way, if they sign it and they lose, they're going to get hung, right? They're going to go. This is treason to the crown. They're probably not going to survive this. So maybe there's a little bit of angst. So suddenly the doors burst open, and somebody rushes in with the news that Moultrie and the militia have defeated the British in Charleston. Hurrah! Get the resolve. We can sign now. This is good. That didn't happen. They didn't get the news later, but still, it must have been a big boost to the confidence of the new nation, in effect, right? The other, I think one of the other reasons why this battle doesn't get the attention it deserves is there are relatively few casualties. Moultrie lost 12 killed, 25 wounded. The Brits had over 200 casualties on the ships. But sometimes we value significance of victory based on casualty count. There were also about
6,000 total Patriot troops in the area. If you count all the militia, the ones that Lee brought down, so he said it was an underdog victory. Well, if you Google it and look at it said, wow, it looks like the Patriots outnumbered the Brits by 3-1. Well, those numbers were spread across in the countryside, mainly on the mainland. They were not a cohesive unit. Would they have risen to the challenge? My contention is, had the Brits taken Moultrie's position, they could have gotten ships right into the firing range into Charlestown. They would have fired a few salvos into Charlestown, and I think there would have been a quick, surrender to stop hostilities. There might have been some more fighting, but would other heroes have arisen? Who knows? But I think it would be a stretch to say that it wouldn't have mattered. Moultrie's victory would not have mattered because they would have stopped him. I don't think they would have, mainly because of the carnage to Charlestown and the resolve of those forces and how disjointed those forces were. And the other reason I think that, well, there are people that say, South Carolina's contribution to American history was erased because of the Civil War. I didn't hear any of that until I came down here. I'm not disagreeing with it. I think it's certainly true that that's part of the reason why this doesn't get the ink it does. The presses were, even in the Revolutionary War, that were controlled in the North. Certainly after the Civil War, any account of South Carolina valor in arms was probably a question. So I think that's part of it too. It happened down here. So why do we know about this? I said, if this was a big deal, how come I haven't heard about this? A good part of that answer is because it happened in South Carolina. Had these events occurred in Boston Harbor, a pantless Commodore, right? You would have, these all be part of American law, part of our early American law. I'm going to finish though with a talk a little bit. Moultrie, after the war, he was a two-time governor, so he had quite a career, kind of a tragic figure. He lost his entire family. He had 2 wives and all his children died before he did. He had a brother that was killed defending Charleston. So his personal life was kind of trauma. He had a lot of trauma in it, but he was, again, my point is he's a very underrated military man, but also patriot. Patrick Henry just did his thing, yesterday? Give me liberty or give me death. Well, this compares, I think, and I'm going to finish with this. This is from my book. The defining passage to me on who Moultrie was is contained in the second volume of his memoirs. Charlestown has fallen and Moultrie is on parole. An old English friend, the Lord Montague, writes him with an offer. Montague has been assigned the command of British troops in Jamaica and wants Moultrie to go with it. He posits that Moultrie has done his duty and he should let younger hands take over if the, quote, the contest, unquote, persists. You now have a fair opening of quitting that service with honor and reputation to yourself by going to Jamaica with me. The world will readily attribute it to the known friendship that has subsisted between us, and by quitting this country for a short time, you would avoid any disagreeable conversations and might return at leisure to take possession of your estates for yourself and your family. He then offers to hand over his command in Jamaica and actually serve under Moultrie, because he said, you're a better general than I am. And this is Moultrie's response. So keep in mind, Moultrie is now on parole. He can't fight. He's not in prison, but he can't fight. But he's in Charlestown. His response: I thank you for your wish to promote my advantage, but I am much surprised at your proposition. I flattered myself that I stood in a more favorable light with you, but I differ widely with you in thinking I have discharged my duty to my country, while it is still deluged with blood and overrun with British troops who exercise the most savage cruelties. When I entered this contest, I did it with the most mature deliberation and with a determined resolve to risk my life and fortune in the cause. I am sorry you should imagine I had so little regard for my reputation as to listen to such dishonorable proposals. You say by quitting this country for a short time I might avoid disagreeable conversations and might return at my leisure and take possession of my estates for myself and family. But you forget to tell me how I am to get rid of the feelings of an injured, honest heart, and where to hide myself from myself. Could I be guilty of so much baseness, I should hate myself and shun mankind. The repossessing of my estates, the offer of command of your regiment, and the honor you propose of serving under me are paltry considerations to the loss of my reputation. And then, you know, in those days, they had a flowery opening, and then a flowery closing, but in the middle it could be vicious, you know, vicious attacks. He closes this with, think better of me, W.M. Moultrie. That's my favorite. Yeah. He's buried behind the visitor center at Fort Moultrie. Very underrated case.
Yes.
Thank you. Questions? Yeah.
Yeah, so was the Moultrie estate?
You know, that's a good question. I don't know. That's where he was, well, he was buried there, I think, initially. But there was some dispute as to where he was buried and why he was buried. I'm not sure he was buried on his estate. I don't know the answer to that question.
But now he is laid to rest at.
At Fort Moultrie, yes.
But he was buried up Ashley Phosphate Road area. But his church is Big in Church, which is on 402. If you go, he and Francis Mary and their families, that was their Anglican church right there, the one that has just the walls up. But I think he lived, the last plantation was not Crowfield, but over on Ashley Phosphate, and that's where he was moved to Sullivan's Island from there.
Yeah, thank you. I should know that, but I don't. Yeah.
Tell us more about the fort itself. How big was it?
Oh, it was to house 1,000 militia. If you know the footprint of Fort Moultrie today,
Yeah?
and I've got a graphic, actually I have it here, I can show it to you. Well, yeah, I did bring it. I can whip it out if you want to see it. But it's Fort number 3, the current fort. It's fairly large.
Okay.
If you overlaid the palmetto log fort over the top of it, it would enclose that fort completely. And it was much closer to the water. But it was to house 1,000 militia.
Yeah.
And where of their activity, there's a movement afoot on Sullivan's Island to do a replica of the palmetto log fort. There was one when the Park Service opened up the visitor center in Fort Moultrie in 1976 for the bicentennial. Hurricane Hugo blew those logs away, and the Park Service has been reluctant to rethink doing that. So right now, when you go to Fort Moultrie, you see the third fort, the Civil War fort, that was there through World War II. And there's nothing on forts 1 and 2 that were there. The palmetto log fort is nothing there. So, but the city of Sullivan's Island might want to think about doing that. So they have plans afoot. They're trying to get money to use a vacant lot and do a palmetto log segment, which would be nice to be able to talk from. There's a miniature of it in the visitor center, but there's nothing that really helps you explain to people what it looked like.
Norm, I was thinking that 250 was given a grant to somebody to rebuild not the fort, but something that kids could, like a replica that kids could play
The
with.
city of Sullivan's Island and one of my colleagues, Mike Walsh, has been spearheading something there. I keep hearing that the plans are not final yet, though. So I'm getting nervous, because I've been a big proponent of this. I say, you can't have a fort there and not talk about this, and something physical is a lot easier to talk from than just, placards that used to be over there,
Well, and the fact that became our state tree too.
Yeah. But I think there are things you could do too with electronic signage now, and using technology to you could show where the ships were in the harbor. You could show the plume, of the palmetto tree plume. You could do a lot of cool stuff if you had money. But again, things are pretty tight right now. Yes.
I have another question. I'm curious about the enslaved people that you said that helped build that.
Mm-hmm.
Do we know, did they bring people from like Sullivan's Island, or were they local plantation
Local
owners that
plantation,
loaned out
yes,
their
local-
people?
local
Did they
plantation.
also,
Yes,
were they fighters as well, and they had their enslaved people? I'm just trying to understand the dynamics of what it would have been like.
from local plantations that would be on loan to do this.
Okay.
Or probably, get compensated, the slave masters would get compensated for their labor.
But I would say that they were not given guns. They were not there to fight, they were just
No.
there to do work.
Right.
Because if you're trying to get a real picture of what was going
Yeah,
on.
but I have heard a different, because I go to these kind of lecture talks and stuff to try
Yeah.
to get it. And there've been a few things where, and I can't say in which instances, but in some cases, some of the enslaved people were allowed to have guns.
Right, but that goes on, I think, a little bit later. This is very early
Okay,
in the war, and I was gonna say that too, but
okay.
you're just asking that.
Yeah, and Sullivan's Island, this is something I tried to dig into, but I can't get the facts. There was basically a slave, it wasn't really a rebellion, but a bunch of slaves went to Sullivan's Island. They were escaped slaves, with the promise that if they could get to British ships, they'd be free. That's what the British were doing. So you can get to one of our ships, you'll be a free person. So the story goes that there were 500 escaped slaves on Sullivan's Island, and then Moultrie and others had to send militia over there to get them back. And there was some bloodshed, and it's very murky in the historical account. As many as 50 slaves were killed. Only 20 got onto British ships. So there was no love lost. That's why I say, did those black pilots that refused to get closer to the walls and help win the battle, did they do that on purpose to help the American cause? No, don't think so. Right?
But was Oscar with Marion at Fort Moultrie? Do we know for sure?
I don't know.
Do you know who was there? This is another, Bannister Tarleton, who gave him his name? The first time he failed to capture Marion? He was on Long Island. He was on Clinton's force at Sullivan's Island. So he never got across the breach. But he was there, so I say that's like the first time that he failed to capture Marion.
The other thing about if they had been able to get on, the sandbar hadn't stopped them at low tide to get around to where the fort was open,
Yes.
that could have been, Marion could have been killed right then.
Oh, God, yes. Absolutely.
And then,
Absolutely.
who knows, he is so prominent in
Yes.
the Southern campaign that I don't think anybody could have taken his place as a
Yeah.
leader.
Yeah. You have to look at all these things that happened, and, it's hard not to think of some kind of divine.
Right. It really is.
Yeah, somebody was on our side,
Yeah.
that's for sure.
And thanks for correcting me. I think in the opening, I said that Marion helped finish up the fort, or
Yeah, it was Moultrie.
helped build, but it was Moultrie
Yeah,
that was in
But
charge.
Marion was part of his crew, so he was second in command at the time.
But I do, going back to the enslaved people, to me, there is something that should be extremely gratifying to know that these enslaved people built that fort, or helped build that fort, and that is our state tree. Do you see what I'm trying to say? That there is, there is a pride there that this, because of this battle, because of what they had done, and they did it so well, that we have the state tree from that battle.
Okay.
I think I'm with her on that one.
Yeah. Right, I know
think
that
that's
they
a
were.
little stretch, maybe.
Yeah, but to me, that some of the workmanship,
Oh, it's fabulous,
That-
there's no doubt about that.
right,
Yeah.
that the enslaved people did during the Revolutionary War,
Absolutely.
we could not have done it
Right,
without
right,
them.
Right.
And there were people that, wanted to allow enslaved to
Right.
take up arms. Okay, thanks for coming, guys, y'all.
It was wonderful.
Thank you.
And I certainly
If you want to look around.
that.